What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Albach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. For those of you guys who listen to the show on a regular basis, you know that we get into politics and culture just about every episode, but it's usually infused into specific areas and platforms, like what's going on YouTube, or with like specific groups of people online through Twitter or 8chan or whatever. But this episode's strictly on political theory, and I really hope you all enjoy it. I had the pleasure of speaking with Ben Burgis. Ben is a logic professor and author of the new book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is available through Zero Books. He's also a regular contributor to Zero Books on YouTube, as well as shows like Michael Brooks' show, which is where I found out about him, and the Serfs, and a bunch of other similar ones on the platform. And I went into this with the idea of strongly representing some common arguments against leftism, and then kind of allowing Ben to answer and go through some of those lines of thinking. And we ended up just kind of riffing on the subject matter. So we started by getting into his background in logic and ideology as a whole, which is something I didn't really know too much about prior to this conversation, which was really interesting. We also talked about the nuances between certain political labels like social democrat or soc dem versus democratic socialist. We also just jumped right into the whole undying supply versus demand side economic argument, which is always there in our faces, and it's good to converse about that. We also talked about what it means to have equality of opportunity, which is a common framed argument with this whole equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, and I don't think that's usually framed in an honest way, so we got into that. We talked about the Nordic models of social democracy and how that's constantly used in arguments, and we also talked about how conservatives and often far-right people argue that Nordic and European countries can have more socialized economies because their populations are more homogenous, which can tie into heritage and culture, but it's also a really sticky area that veers into race, and it can make the debate really difficult, especially when you're not always dealing with honest actors. But yeah, there's a lot more we got into, which I'm sure I'm forgetting about here. It was a great conversation, and I'd encourage you all to check out Ben's work. Like I said, you can find him on YouTube and various platforms. You can find him on Twitter at Ben Burgis. I'll have links in the show notes. But yeah, this is definitely subject matter I'm planning to cover more of when I launch my Twitch channel next month. I just think it's incredibly important to have basic understandings of these critiques and differences between free market capitalist thought and then leftist thought, there's just so much there. So yeah, hope you all enjoy it, and as always, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Now let's get into what's really good. Ben Burgis, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm real stoked to get into the weeds with you on some of this stuff here. I've been enjoying your takes the past year or so on Michael Brooks' show and Zero Books and all those other media platforms, and I enjoy your style. I mean, for people who don't listen to your stuff regularly, I mean, your style is really unique. In leftist circles, I'll say, particularly as someone who you go out of your way to attack common arguments and fallacies from the right with actual arguments. You do your best to actually hit them at their strongest rather than knocking down straw men all the time. So I really enjoy the way you go about that. I think it's fascinating, and I want to get into some of those specific arguments here. But before we kind of take a deep dive into any one of them, I want to get a little bit of background on you, because I feel like most appearances that you do with debates or other shows, I mean, you kind of just jump right in to policy stuff. So I mean, like, what initially got you into philosophy and logic?
Sure. So philosophy was really kind of a trial and error thing. As an undergrad, I came into college. I started at my local community college in Michigan. I was a super shitty student in high school. was definitely enjoying the skipping class and smoking pot parts of life. But I'd actually come into college at that local community college with the intention of getting like a technical degree and trying to get like a skilled trades like factory job. That was my initial plan, because I never particularly enjoyed school.
Yeah.
But then I actually, I took some electives, humanities kinds of things, and I enjoyed them. I transferred a couple times and I took some time off, but, I ended up kind of making my way to philosophy by trial and error. And that's what I kind of found myself drawn to. And if anything, actually, so people kind of make a distinction. I don't know how much of this we should, get into for listeners between like analytic philosophy and what's sometimes called continental philosophy.
Yeah, no, please get into it.
So continental philosophy roughly is the kind of philosophy that if you think about guys like this sort of mid-20th century guys like Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, or Martin Heidegger, or like later people like Jacques Derrida. So, people who are like, German or often French and write like in styles that are often hard to penetrate, but like they seem like they have really interesting things to say. That's kind of very roughly one kind of philosophy, like even that you could do, even though it's named after obviously the European continent, it's a kind of philosophy that there's plenty of, in the United States. And it's certainly the kind of philosophy that's like all over the place in other academic disciplines where they just call it like theory. And then there's analytic philosophy, which sort of traces back to one of my heroes, both philosophically and politically, Bertrand Russell, and sort of originates, confusingly enough, given the names, also kind of originates in Europe. But I remember Brian Leiter once said that the two people who did the most for the development of philosophy in the United States were Margaret Thatcher and Adolf Hitler. The theory being that Thatcher, through budget cuts, sent a lot of British academics to the United States, essentially, and Hitler obviously drove a lot of academics, out of the country, out of Germany, fleeing for their lives.
Right.
So you had these guys called the Vienna Circle, who influenced, what's later became analytic philosophy, which is more associated with the U.S. and the U.K. And some of that was like originally about this particular kind of philosophical program that has to do with, like what's something like logical positivism, but really that's kind of ancient history now. So what people really use the phrase analytic philosophy to mean is less any kind of specific philosophical program than just kind of a general style of doing philosophy that really emphasizes making really clear, precise arguments. And that second tradition is what I ended up getting into. But the first one is what kind of got me into philosophy in the first place. Like one of the first books I read about philosophy was an anthology edited by Walter Kaufman called Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre. And I thought that was really interesting. And I'd kind of taken a bunch of humanities-ish classes. And so I thought this was, one of the periods in between institutions as I kind of muddled my way through undergrad, that like when I went back, I tried taking some philosophy classes and I got into that, even though I sort of ended up in this more analytic-y kind of philosophy. And in particular, when it comes to logic, so I never actually took any logic classes as an undergrad. And I had started my master's program at Western Michigan. I graduated a semester late because I failed like a really like not very impressive gen ed requirement science class because I was too busy organizing anti-war protests. This was like spring of 2003. And so the way this master's program worked, generally in your first year, you were a TA, and your second year you taught your own classes. So I didn't really know how this was going to work for me because I came in the spring semester until I sort of noticed my name on the schedule, Burgis, Symbolic Logic. I thought, well, hell, I've never taken this class. So I kind of spent the summer teaching myself symbolic logic from the textbook. And then, I'm sure those first couple semesters I was teaching it were awful, because I didn't know what I was doing. And, I was like learning a lot of this stuff myself, but,
Right, right.
it got me really interested in the subject. And I ended up writing my PhD dissertation on issues about logical paradoxes and things related to that.
Yeah, super cool, man. So, like, did your interest in philosophy lead to your interest in politics, or vice versa, or did they kind of parallel with each other?
They paralleled with each other. So the interest in politics preceded the interest in philosophy. Like I kind of alluded to earlier, I was very involved in the anti-war movement in 2002, 2003. The first, I no longer think that this is a helpful electoral strategy. But the first time I bothered to vote when I was 20 in 2000 was to vote for Ralph Nader as kind of a anti-establishment middle finger.
Right, right.
But I also my experience was that like during most of the years, sort of in between then and like maybe 2016, I kind of had these fairly hard leftist political views, but it was a very small part of my life. It was like I kind of read Glenn Greenwald articles and occasionally get into arguments with my liberal friends at the bar about drone strikes, it was that kind of thing.
Right.
And then like a lot of people, I think when the Bernie campaign happened in 2016, that kind of politically reinvigorated me. And, I joined DSA and all of that stuff. And at that point it gets very boring because it's like every single other guy who, is,
right. We've heard this narrative before.
Yeah. Like, I'm a, well, not anymore because I've moved, but like up until very recently, I was I was like a portly bearded guy with glasses, who's a socialist who lived in greater New York. And that's like, that you can,
I can see the memes right now. Yeah.
Uncommon or particularly fascinatingly unique type.
Right. So I mean, okay, did you reach leftism as a political philosophy in that post anti-war movement, or was this something before, like when you were studying philosophy, were you into Marx? Like how did you initially kind of like get into this ideology?
No, it was definitely before then. I'd read like just out of general interest, I'd read, the Communist Manifesto from like my middle school library, I think when I was 13, and I was always very like interested in stuff like that. And not that I came from, my parents hadn't been politically active since, long before I came along, but they had been, involved in radical student stuff, in the Vietnam era. So I'd kind of, red diaper baby would be a serious exaggeration, but it's not, but I did pick up a little bit of it from from that background, and it was a long-standing interest. The socialism came before the philosophy.
Okay, cool. All right, man. Yeah, like we can jump in, and that's all super interesting. I didn't know any of that, so really cool to know. I figured, and we messaged a bit about this before the show. I mean, I figured it'd be cool, like as someone coming from the left, like as myself, I thought it'd be at least interesting to do my best attempt at playing a devil's advocate, sort of to kind of like help steelman some of these common libertarian conservative arguments against leftism. I mean, where I grew up, I'm right outside of Philly. I mean, most of my friends and family are either conservative leaning or maybe they're like libertarian, center right, center left ish liberals. So I mean, in terms of understanding a lot of these deeper like political philosophies and like socioeconomic understandings of even just terms like social democrat versus democratic socialist. So I mean, I figure we can just jump in here with like a few of the common ones, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see how far we get down the line. But the one I'm thinking of first, I mean, it's like the most common one that we hear. It's like that, capitalists tend to argue that more wealth inequality in a society is like where the rich get richer. It's kind of this idea that the rising tide raises all boats, right? Where like if
Mhm.
rich people can get richer, they can invest that money into their businesses, creating more jobs. They can donate more of it to charities that that creates more like better living standards for people in areas that need it, and just in general create more jobs for the economy. So I mean, that's the sort of trickle down economic view, I guess. I
Mhm.
mean, so in your perspective, I mean, wouldn't
Mhm.
is this not good for the economy? I mean, like what happens when forms of a socialism reduce the ability to accumulate wealth to stimulate the economy?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, but maybe it's worth separating out a few strands. So one is economic inequality, and the other is being able to get rich, which are not necessarily the same thing, of course, because you could have societies with varying degrees of economic inequality where people like there's still a pathway for upward mobility through that society, right?
Hmm.
Like maybe the ladder doesn't go as high in some as in others, but it's a distinction that's maybe worth holding on to, especially when we're talking about social democracy, because oftentimes people talk about this as if the alternatives were starker than they necessarily are in practice. So I remember, for example, in 2016, in one of the very first debates in the primary, there was this wonderful moment where I think, God, what was his name? Mike Malloy. Is that him? The guy who's like the third candidate initially in that primary.
Hey, I forget honestly.
Okay, so whatever that guy's name was, yeah, and the guy the guy who's like the mayor of Baltimore is like the one presumably the character in the late seasons of The Wire was based on, but he'd said something about socialism and why socialism is bad, and Hillary Clinton kind of jumped on it, and she was like, well, I think of capitalism, and I think of people are able to start businesses and be successful, and we're not Denmark. And then you could tell it was almost like gears were grinding in her head, like visibly. There's like, oh no, I might have alienated some Danish American voter. And she said, I love Denmark. But of course, the unexamined thing in all that is that, well, hold on, people can't start their own businesses in Denmark, right? Like, I'm fairly sure that quite a few people have. And this is a place where I think there are a couple things to be said here. So, and I don't want to get ahead of myself because I know earlier you talked about defining some of these terms and making the distinctions. So when we talk about social democracy, this is a term that's meant some very different things in very different contexts. Like in the early 20th century, it was pretty much just a synonym for socialism. Late 19th, early 20th centuries. Then it was sort of often referred to kind of the idea that there's like a gradual path towards socialism. But most of the way that most people seem to use the term now, and the way I'm going to use it, is to refer to certain kinds of like sweeping reforms that still happen within capitalism.
Right.
So like we talk about social democracy, we're talking about things like single payer health insurance, or making college tuition free, the postal banking, all these kind of ideas for things that would maybe even take certain parts of the economy outside of capitalist control, but are things that you could have, and in many places in the world you do have within capitalism. And I'm going to contrast that to socialism in the strict sense, which means like replacing capitalism with a new economic system. And we can talk about what that might look like. But for now, just thinking about social democracy, I'd make 2 points about the connection between social democracy and this idea that, like, well, you want to allow rich people to a greater freedom of economic movement, because then, they'll have all this money, they'll be able to invest it in the economy, rising tide lifts all boats, et cetera, et cetera. And so you don't want to mess with that by going too social democratic. And I'd say two things about that argument. The first one is that there are actually some ways in which these social democratic reforms can make it easier for people to do things like start their own businesses. Because I think if you're like most people, if like somebody told you tomorrow, hey, I've got this great idea for like a small business we could start, one of your first questions will be, okay, but what's my health insurance going to look like?
Right.
Right. What happens if it fails? Like how badly off are we going to be if it fails? Because like the vast majority of new businesses fail in the first few years. And I think if you have this cushion of a bigger welfare state, that can actually help people who are in more tenuous circumstances to start businesses. I don't want to romanticize small business. I have plenty of problems with the way most small businesses work. But I'm just saying, if that is a concern of yours, then of the hypothetical yours, right?
Yeah, right.
Then that's something to think about. And then the other, and I think maybe even more important point, because I think this is something that's going to come up kind of a lot in these arguments, is that we don't need to just speculate about this stuff a priori, right? Like we don't have to say, oh, what would happen if we had all of these social democratic programs, because we can actually look. Right. It's all, I mean, like sometimes having these arguments with conservatives or especially certain kinds of libertarians, you almost feel like, Galileo, begging people to like pick up the telescope and look for themselves. Right. Because we actually do have a lot of evidence from around the world about how these things play out in practice. And so if you're concerned about, okay, what's the standard of living going to be like for ordinary people if we're gonna control the movement of the economic tides, which we're concerned with lifting all boats, we can look at places like, we could look at pretty much anywhere in Western Europe that has gone further in this direction than the U.S. has, especially the Nordics. Mm-hmm. Especially like, Sweden in the 70s, that's probably the high watermark of social democracy. And those places look pretty good to me, right? Like I mean, there are problems, of course, we can get into, but like the sort of Nordic social democracies at their best look like about the most decent societies that have ever existed. And certainly, like, if you just want to look at self-reported happiness, to this day, right, like those societies which, don't have like, Sweden today is not what Sweden was in the 70s, but it still has still has one of the most expansive welfare states in the world. And if you look at like those indexes of global happiness, those consistently come in as some of the happiest countries in the world, which is amazing. Right. Because it's dark like 18 hours a day and it's miserably cold, but yeah. Social democracy seems to help. Now there's probably a further part of the argument we could get into about like, okay, what about, like you could say, hey, but I know you don't just advocate social democracy. I know you'd like to go further than that. And how does that play in? Because we can't just look at some convenient, pre-existing model. And that's something we could certainly get into, but I've been talking for a while here, so
No, that's great. Yeah, I feel like, man, it stinks because like the Nordic model, I feel like is the quintessential example that's always pointed toward in terms of both sides of this argument. Like you have, conservatives will, if a leftist looks at the Nordic countries like Denmark or Finland or whatever and says, hey, look, here's a successful social democracy, then like you got the more libertarian conservative types being like, well, that's actually like a capitalist country. Like that's like they'll defend it in terms of like the free market aspects of those economies. But then you get it from the other side too, when like in the U.S. when you start talking about more regulation, more like social safety nets in terms of like free healthcare and all that, then you're like, hey, we should have these things like those Nordic countries have. Then you get conservatives being like, well, no, that's socialism. So it's kind of like this weird thing where you're battling it from both sides, and it can be tough to kind of like plant yourself in any way. And I know I'd be interested to get your take on this because I know a lot of conservatives and especially a lot of people in the alt-right, like far-right people, will often rebut a lot of what you said. What we're talking about here with the Nordic model by being like, well, the difference between the US as a country and a lot of these Nordic and European countries is that they're smaller and they're more homogenous in terms of
Uh,
race and all that. So, I mean, like, do you want to kind of get into
yeah,
debunking any of that, or is it worth it?
sure, yeah. And just to absolutely. So, and just first to circle back to the first part of what you said, it is really interesting that game about like, okay, uh, are the are the Nordics basically models of how free market society should work, or
Exactly.
are they, or like, would that be horribly socialist? Because there are clips of people like Bill O'Reilly or Ben Shapiro saying, oh, Norway is basically, is this like totally capitalist place, but they have this like, but they've got like the state oil company to use this as slush fund and this and that. I was thinking, okay, great. So like, how would you feel if I said we should nationalize the big oil companies in the United States
Right.
and then use that to pay for generous social programs? Would you be like, yeah, good enough, still pretty capitalist,
Yeah.
like, and by the way, on that note, something that like, if you've anybody who's heard me at other forums has probably heard me say this before, but like I kind of feel, uh, I'm very willing to be like Cato the Elder level repetitive about this. It just deserves to be said over and over and over again. All these same people who say, oh yeah, no, the Nordics are basically, models of free market societies, it's all totally fine. Like, there's nothing socialist to see there. Also constantly point to the economic crisis in Venezuela as evidence of the folly of socialism. But not only do all the Nordics have bigger public sectors than Venezuela does, France has a bigger public sector than Venezuela does.
I was gonna say, I mean, like, isn't it literally less than 10 or 20% of Venezuela's economy is socialized or something? It's like, it's minuscule.
Yeah, totally. And it's actually a really nice one-to-one comparison with Norway because in both cases, those public sectors are inflated by the oil companies that have controlling shares owned by the state. So yeah, absolutely. It's actually not that much bigger than the United States, and it's a little bit smaller than France.
Right.
So whatever you think about the sort of semantic argument about how to use the word socialism, and obviously I have my own views about that we can get into, but like on any way of using that word, there's no way of making Venezuela socialist without making France socialist, without making Norway super socialist. That like it's a package deal. So yeah. So then like you have this second argument you're talking about. So the first line of defense is no, it's okay. Norway and Sweden are super capitalist. And then of course, as you say, when you turn around and say, okay, so can we be super capitalist just like them, right?
Yep.
Then you hear no, that's actually very socialist after all. And then, but then the sort of second line of defense is, well, no, they can only be that socialist because they're so homogenous. And this can mean a couple of different things. And so the maybe like kind of uncharitable way of parsing it, but like in at least certain contexts, it's very hard not to read it this way, is that you're basically saying that like somehow this can work better because everybody's white, that's
Yep.
like, but there's also a kind of weird, like, pseudo woke liberal version of the argument, which is where you sort of, as far as I can best reconstruct it, it goes something like this: that these countries, they can only like. It's not that the laws of economics work differently when everybody's white. It's that it's only politically viable to have these extensive social democratic programs, given the homogeneity. And so the sort of implication of this version of the argument is that, hey, it would be great. I love this as much as you would, but we just can't do it because like those damn racist white working class people would never support things that they see as like mostly going towards like black and Hispanic people.
Yep. Right.
That's the woke version of the argument. And I guess that second one is the one that's worth focusing on, because if we could just kind of take it as a given that if you're actually talking about like the nuts and bolts of it, right? Like how it works, then I just don't even know what the argument would look like if you tried to fill that out, that somehow like these social programs have different economic consequences, right, in homogenous societies. That's very hard to make sense of. And sometimes people will talk about how small they are. There's like even Canada, only has 10% as many people in the United States. So the fact that single payer healthcare works well in Canada, you can't conclude anything about that about the United States. And I've always found that argument baffling because it seems like, well, okay, so you only have 10% as many recipients in Canada, but you also only have 10% as many taxpayers, right? So,
right.
Like, what I don't understand what the objection is. So the version of this kind of cluster of arguments that I can best understand, like, where they're coming from and what they're trying to say, and like I can make some sense of it, is the sort of woke argument that like it's not that it wouldn't work in a larger, more diverse country. It's just that it wouldn't politically work, that you wouldn't be able to get political support because of racial division. And of course, there's a germ of truth to that, which is that racism has been a very powerful tool to use against left-wing economic ideas in the United States historically. That, certainly there's a long history of employers, especially in the South, using like divide and conquer tactics racially. You have a strike by white workers, you bring in, black scabs, vice versa, things like that. And certainly the fear that, it's certainly true in all sorts of ways that race has been weaponized to against the labor movement and against social democracy in U.S. history. But it's also true that the opposite has happened, that the sort of that like an economic agenda that can appeal to working class people of all races has been very effectively used to counter racism, right? There's been plenty of that. So just to pick an obvious historical example from close to where I grew up in mid-Michigan, obviously well before my time, but like the UAW was all over the civil rights movement. Like if you look at any pictures from the 1964 March on Washington, which we now always forget, by the way, was the full title was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Like half of the placards are like, UAW placards on there. And so there are certainly times when seeing common economic interests have actually helped white working class people sort of see that they need to unite with working class people of other races to achieve them. And that's not like hypothetical, right? That's happened plenty of times. And also on a really nuts and bolts level, the prediction that you would make based on this theory is that as the United States got more and more diverse, support for social democratic policies would go down. And of course, historically, exactly the opposite's happened. That the United States, between like the 1950s and present, has become more and more internally diverse, but like Medicare for all, for example, is something that is having a political movement in the sun like it's never had before.
Right.
It's always polled well, but like it's now like actually treated as like on the table. And even the S word, socialism, like people, like more Americans than at any point ever in history identify as socialists. And I think that, of course, look, people are complicated. You're going to get people who have bad and reactionary views on all kinds of topics, but like maybe also like the idea of having healthcare, and
right.
et cetera. You're going to get people's political views are going to come in very messy bundles. But that itself, to me, is an argument in favor of running on these kinds of social democratic policies, because there are people who are maybe racist enough that, they could be sucked into the orbit of like a racial demagogue like Trump, but they're also economically populist enough that they could be persuaded to go in the other direction, by the right candidate.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more of that. I mean, even just in the recent like Joe Rogan, Bernie Sanders podcast, when you look at a lot of the comments on YouTube and online that have been made by a lot of like the listeners, which I think I'd categorize at least politically as an audience member. I mean, I've listened to his podcast on and off since 2011 or so, and
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely leans libertarian and in
Hmm.
recent years more right wing as he's had more big names like Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder and these guys on. So it's been interesting to watch the aftermath of like the Cornel West and then the Bernie Sanders episodes, just in seeing a lot of these people who you can tell by the rhetoric that they're coming from much more libertarian and even reactionary politics, but the responses are, oh, I might not agree on A, B, and C, but he has a great point when it comes to these like policies of free healthcare and like corrupt corporate institutions and all this. And it is really interesting to watch that tide kind of shift in real time with these people who,
Hmm.
if socially you would maybe at a glance think, oh, that person is completely down the rabbit hole on that far right side, like you're not going to get through to them. But when it comes to like this age of populism and like the post financial crisis, where now like there are these different populist rises and like the alt right and then like the Occupy and now the new socialist movements that are coming up. It's like there's a lot more chance for crossover, I think, between those two groups when you tap the right buttons. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no question. Yes, like a lot of the, I mean, it was kind of amazing reading through a lot of the comments on that Rogan thread, like the YouTube comments, um, because like so many of them, it was just so obvious that this was the first time that they've heard somebody make the case for these policies in like an extended way ever. And it really shows the broad appeal of them because there's so many comments that were like, yeah, I always thought Bernie was crazy, but like now that he laid it all out, yeah, that sounds really good. Maybe I could actually like, maybe if we had Medicare for all that, covered, that like didn't make a distinction between physical and mental illness, maybe I could actually like, get my psychiatric medication and, et cetera, right?
Right.
Like there were all these like just in a really like bread and butter kind of way, there were all these people who could see how it could benefit them. And having actually just spent like I mean, really, it's a terrible indictment of the mainstream media that you only get, that you only really get like this kind of like really extended friendly interview on something like
Right.
Joe Rogan, like.
You'd think at this point too, because all those establishment platforms like CNN, MSNBC, they're on like Facebook Live and YouTube, so you'd think there would be more access to these long form style interviews, but it's just not. It's almost like they know that it's not in their best interest to actually let candidates speak their mind when it's outside of their talking points, because they know it would only lead into these more populist corners of the web, which is primarily run by younger people who are looking for those ideologies already. So it's like, yeah, it's a not a good look on their
No,
part.
no, it's not.
Yeah,
And by the way, like it's also like let's not let the left off the hook here. That there are a lot of people on the left whose reaction to like Bernie Sanders announcing he was going to go on Rogan or announcing he was going to do the town hall on Fox was, oh no, you can't do that because like these platforms are bad, and so you're like polluting yourself with badness by going on there, which I really feel that kind of taboo against leftists making our case in places where people who don't already agree with us are going to
yeah.
hear it is like really self-defeating.
I totally agree, and I feel like in terms of looking at the types of leftists who make those arguments, and I mean, if I were to look at what is like the best solution against a grift, like what's the best
Right.
solution against the types of people like a Dave Rubin or like a Tim Pool, these types of guys who they plan their public associations and their views and their rhetoric in ways that intentionally align them with groups of people who are going to pay into them to essentially pay
Hmm.
pay them to speak back to them what they already think. And it's a revolving door thing where like you get these YouTube shows and podcasts where all these guys like they rotate with each other's shows, and a lot of them have these kind of like front facing guises to pretend that they're, I used to be on the left, or I'm a true liberal, or I voted for Bernie Sanders, or whatever it is. And then it kind of gives them this license to make reactionary talking points. But like when I look at that pattern, which has been prevalent over the past few years, like, and I think about what the solution to that is, I mean, the solution to that is radical authenticity. And when you have someone like a Bernie Sanders or a Cornel West, I mean, their convictions are so undeniable that when you put one of those guys on like a Fox News panel or a show like a Dave Rubin's show or a Joe Rogan's show, it almost, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, because I don't want to say the audience doesn't matter, because obviously, interpretation and all that, like there's definitely nuance involved. But I think if you're talking about, it's a bad idea because, it kind of cross-pollinates these groups, and these groups of people aren't great. It's like, well, what better solution to bring those people over than to bring like the most authentic, non-grifting people to that platform to then demonstrate these views? Because that someone like Bernie isn't going to go on a show like Rogan and like play into whatever like anti-SJW type talking points that a lot of like Rogan's left-leaning guests like kind of play into, because they know that's his thing. And like that's I don't know. I think that's the key
totally.
In terms of reaching that across the aisle to get those people on the opposing populist side. Because I mean, what else can you do at that point? I mean, if you're rejecting some of the biggest media platforms in the world, which I'd argue Rogan's show probably is in like the top 10 ever,
right,
like at this point. I mean, it's massive in reach, and if you're denying leftists to go on that for the sake of some kind of purity test, I mean, it's kind of it's just so counterproductive. I don't know.
No, absolutely. Unrelated footnote to all that, by the way, I loved the Cornel West interview on Rogan, and on on a non-political point, since early on he was going on and on about Anton Chekhov's short stories and how amazing they are. You haven't lived until you've read this stuff. And so like I listened to that, and a couple days later, my wife and I are visiting my parents in Michigan right now, and I was like looking at one of their bookshelves, and there's this like there was a collection of Chekhov stories there. I was like, I should really read some of this stuff.
That's awesome.
So I've actually been reading some Chekhov stories the last few days because Cornel West told me to.
That's beautiful. Well, okay, that actually gets to a great point that I was thinking of earlier when we were talking about the sort of the arguments that get propped up about the homogenous societies of these Nordic countries. And I was thinking while you were responding to that, I mean, if I'm trying to put myself in the heads of some of the people who have these views, and I grew up with a pretty conservative family, so it doesn't take too much for me to be able to like empathize and try to understand like what builds this type of perspective. And to the point of the Cornel West episode, I mean, I think just to kind of tie this together, I mean, I think he did such a good job in that episode getting deep into culture over politics. And I think that that's such an underutilized tool on the left, because it's so easy to get like lost in political philosophy and theory. And eventually you just lose these large portions of the mainstream who are really, they're going after, what's in pop culture, like what's in music and art and these public figures like comedy. And that's how people relate and communicate ideas in large part. I mean, that you kind of infuse whatever political or, social beliefs into those art pieces and those like social pieces. So I think he's so brilliant in terms of like speaking about all these great musicians and writers and figures of the past 100 or so years that can speak to Rogan and his audience in a way that they're used to hearing. And on that same note, I think a lot of conservatives and libertarians, when they look at a lot of these arguments against socialism, and like I'm thinking again back to this like Nordic model thing, like I think you get into this dicey territory there with the homogeny argument, because obviously it's race related. So you have people on the far right making this, whether it's upfront about race or maybe they're trying to be like Richard Spencer and code it in pretty language and be like, oh, it's not white supremacy, it's white nationalism, like it's a peaceful ethno state. And you get a lot of that kind of like weird dicing up of language to kind of trick people. And then you move slightly left to just like kind of your traditional establishment conservatives, And that's where I think you get the heart of the Republican Party in general, like the vast majority of people that come from these, traditional Christian, white, affluent backgrounds. And when I look back over the past like 50, 70 or so years, like since the 1960s or so, I mean, you look at the way the country has changed so drastically since that period, just on a cultural level.
Mm-hmm.
I think just in terms of like just thinking about the languages they speak. I mean, prior to that time, I mean, like the America was seen as roughly like a country, at least theoretically, built on Judeo-Christian values, and it came from this tradition of of capitalism, neoliberalism that was unlike nearly any other country at the time. I mean, it's much more just right on the economic scale than really anywhere else you could point to in terms of personal freedoms and leading into corporatism and all that. So I think to see the kind of shift from then to now of the rise in secularism and the kind of like decrease of what they would consider Judeo-Christian values, as like multiculturalism has taken a stronghold in more countries. Like you have much more much more diverse immigration, much more diverse beliefs, like the rise of atheism. And I think you get this clash, right, where the conversation in a lot of conservatives' minds, even if it kind of veers into this weird, dicey race territory where like they're talking about Muslims and Mexicans who, technically aren't race, but like it's race related. So it's kind of like,
Sure.
you know what it all means. But I think to kind of, again, to steelman it, to kind of put it in their perspective, I think on a lot of terms they're thinking about it in terms of what they would call heritage or culture. Like the U.S. has this history of having a certain heritage, or European and Nordic countries have histories of being a sort of heritage, and then they view these outsiders like people coming from Muslim majority countries, or Mexicans or people from Central South America coming at the border. They view these people like as impeding on their heritage in a way, and it kind of creates this weird thing because today, I mean, like in terms of what our country looks like, I mean, religion is still a strong thing. Like there's a large religious right and all that, but we're seeing again this drastic rise in secularism and multiculturalism as like the world kind of gets smaller and we all have the internet, and we're able to kind of look across the aisle in ways that we can never do before. And Marxism, particularly as like a materialist philosophy, it kind of does this thing where it attacks religion at its core by being based in the here and now, like in the material world, whereas religion has traditionally always been about the afterlife and believing in what you can't see. And just kind of taking a broad, big picture look at the U.S. as a country again, kind of going back to how it's kind of changed, and its values have shifted a bit, and like new people groups have converged. I mean, do you think that kind of makes Marxism and socialism and all these leftist ideologies the even bigger boogeyman to conservatives and like people that come from these like Judeo-Christian backgrounds, because they have like grown up essentially through generations of relying on this religious or spiritual worldview that kind of grounds everything that they believe, and then Marxism comes in and it's like, well, here, this is like a solution for people in real time. Like this is about getting people, at least in the modern context, like we're using this as a tool to get people things that they need. We're talking about like raising the minimum wage and getting free healthcare and free college, and that all of a sudden becomes so much more appealing to a mass audience in an age where there is just much more access to information and there's more secularism. So do you think like that plays a large role in terms of like the kind of cultural clash between these groups?
Yeah, somewhat. So, I mean, it's interesting hearing your description, which I think is right, because, of course, Judeo-Christian is like a very recent phrase, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's pretty much something you only see like post World War II,
right?
And it doesn't. And then like you sort of try to nail down what that means, and it's not totally clear because you think okay, well, all right, I understand what you mean by Judeo-Christian if you're using it as like a shorthand for like what like religious scholars might call like the Abrahamic religions, or like religions that can like trace their origins back to the Old Testament, right? But then you'd have to throw in Islam, right?
Right.
And in fact, like, not to put too fine a point on this, like, in a lot of ways, Judaism and Islam have more in common with each other than either one has in common with Christianity, dietary codes, etc. And then what gets particularly funny about this is when people talk about, this Judeo-Christian heritage, or, the West. Well, of course, what they mostly want to contrast the West with is Islam. So that's one problem.
Right.
Then, like, when you start thinking about the West, well, what about like Latin America? How does that fit in? Because that's the other like outsider group, that you were talking about, how these people are often very afraid that, like, that they're coming in and messing with their heritage, but of course, forget Judeo-Christian, right? Latin America is almost uniformly Christian.
Yeah,
right?
A lot of Catholics.
yeah. And so you think, and in fact, it's these are much less secular countries than the United States. So if really what you cared about was this sort of Christian religiosity, then it seems like you'd want there to be as much Latin American immigration as at all possible.
Right.
Which isn't to, I mean, I'm not trying to like just make a kind of cheap point about, how, conservatism is hypocritical or, inconsistent or anything there. I mean, it is, but I mean, like, that's kind of the least interesting thing you could say about all this. But like, it also shows you something about how little, because I think, lots of people who say things like this are totally sincere, but like, it shows you about how little in touch maybe with their own motivations that they often are, because people like the sound of like the heritage of the West, but really these are often people who know the least about it, right? Because honestly, it's going to sound a little bit simplistic, but the more you know about real history, the less likely you are to subscribe to this kind of rosy conservative view of it, and it's very like certainly like to the extent that these views that you have about the West and our heritage and all that are bound up with his ideas that, like, the American experiment is particularly good because people can, like, work, like hard work is rewarded and all this stuff. And of course, the more you know about the economic history of the real world, there's a passage in it's somewhere late in Capital Volume 1 which is not, anybody who's like glanced through that book, it's not a book that's mostly written in riveting language.
Very difficult to read.
Yeah. But one of the few kind of striking poetic passages in there is about how capital enters this world, dripping blood and dirt from every pore. And like, really, it's very hard to know anything about actual history without kind of coming to that conclusion, right? That there's not, that we do not have a distribution of wealth that's based on some sort of meritocratic, this division of resources based on hard work and effort, and we certainly don't have anything that's based on the other half of that phrase is usually working hard and playing by the rules. And if by playing by the rules you mean some sort of idealized free market rules, what like the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick calls capitalistic acts between consenting adults, that's really not the history of the economy of the real world. Like the fact that people who are descended from slaves are much more likely to be on the bottom of the economic hierarchy than people who aren't, like that's not a coincidence. And that's such an obvious point, but like it really does show you something about how people who feel the need to, to whom this narrative really appeals to them, need to have kind of exist in this sort of hazy, like, sort of very forgiving kind of like sepia tone like version of American history but I guess to get back to your question about, Cornel West and using culture and everything like that, then the question from a strategic perspective for the left is like, okay, how do you counter that, right? Like, do you counter that by sort of, stepping up on your soapbox and shrilly screaming that, America, KKK, is terrible,
Mm-hmm.
and like sort of morally scolding people, or do you counter it by saying that, well, doing a lot of the stuff that West was doing in that interview, saying, hey, okay, I like the idea of looking back at our cultural heritage too. So let's talk about, you like comedians. You're always complaining about people being too sensitive, about comedy, right? So like, let's talk about, Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor and, George Carlin, and have,
Right.
and like have this very, this very like, this very rich, very diverse, very unconservative kind of history that you can tap into that might actually, add up to a more appealing vision, especially if you combine it with, with a political program that could like really help people in obvious ways. And then I guess just to address the last part of your question that I had before about, whereas I'm certainly an atheist and a materialist, but I mean, I've always got a soft spot for religious socialists. There's a rich, there's a rich history there too.
Right.
So, like I could have we can, we could argue, we could argue about the cosmological argument and whether, whether God exists, because, philosophy is fun. And so I'm perfectly head down for that conversation. But meanwhile, we could also march together for $15 in a union.
Right. And so much of this comes back down to like why I brought that up initially. It's just offering people a story, like a better story than whatever the opposing side is. And to kind of get back to what you were getting into there, I mean, it's so interesting how just befuddled the more conservative Christian narrative is around these amorphous views of heritage and culture and Judeo-Christian values. And it really is odd because it's kind of like they've essentially hijacked what are known as Enlightenment values and like the period of the Enlightenment, which is largely a period, looking back, known as like it's an increase of secularism and science and these new ways of viewing the world. But they take the bits and pieces of that kind of almost revolve around the emergence of capitalism, and then use that to kind of like sync with like modern Judeo-Christian worldviews. And it's kind of this weird marrying of ideologies which we've seen for decades now. And yeah, it's bizarre because it kind of puts, like you were saying before, it kind of puts you in this weird position where if you're in that headspace, when you're thinking like, well, like here we are, we're in post-enlightenment where we have this new set of values and it's way better than feudalism, like it's way better than slavery. But like then you have all these people emerging on the other end of that spectrum who are getting like the short end of the capitalist stick, who are essentially saying, well, yeah, like it is a lot better than feudalism and slavery, but it could be better. Like what's this next thing? And I feel like just going back through all these terms, I mean, it's just a reinforcement of an idea that I think I've had for a while now, that just the right in general is so much better than the left at constructing narratives. Like they can just construct these storylines that are so simple and so just coherent in terms of reaching their audience. I mean, it's just very easy. It's like, oh, you're a Christian, you believe this. You're a conservative, you believe this. And I think it was actually, oddly enough, it was David Pakman I heard recently said something like, he said something like, when it comes to like the argument of taxation, like conservatives have, leftists and liberals beat at every turn because their argument's simple. You should be able to keep the money you earn, and that's it. Like once you've made that argument, if you're trying to like oppose that, and you start by saying, well, yeah, but this and this, like you've already lost so many people because it's just like it's more nuanced, it's more complex, and it's harder to get across in form of narrative. So I think that's why a lot of this is so interesting with like the reemergence of leftism and these ideas of Marx and this new socialist populist movement behind Bernie, that like a lot of these new narratives are now becoming attractive to people, and it's actually offering people something on like the ideological level and the materialist level, which hasn't really existed in a long time in a way where masses of people could actually cling to it for meaning, you know, because I think when you're on the right, it's a lot easier to cling to religion. It's a lot easier to cling to tradition as like the kind of set of values that you see the world through, and you grow up through that, and it's very binary. And on the left, like there's just not it's a lot more loose and open, and you could go in a million directions as far as like becoming like a secular humanist, or you know, like a progressive spiritual person, or a postmodernist, or a Marxist. Like there's all these just various loose ideologies, and through this new populist socialist movement, it's a lot more grounded and centralized, I think, which is offering a new narrative for people.
Yeah, no, I think so. You know, you're talking earlier about the Enlightenment, and of course, I think, well, I don't know, there's a little bit of a split there because, you know, some people like, you know, Ben Shapiro, who unpleasant professional obligation. I did read his book, The Right Side of History, and in there he does like, you know, in there he just barely knows enough about like a lot of what was going on in the Enlightenment to not like it. But you certainly have all these people like Steven Pinker, who has a book called Enlightenment Now, and
Right.
And you know, like there's certainly a lot of, you know, in that sort of libertarian / intellectual dark web. Oh, I'm a liberal. I just don't like, you know, these new liberals. You know, in that kind of spectrum of conservatism, there's certainly a lot of love for what they imagine the Enlightenment to be there. One thing that actually, politics aside, that I find very annoying about this is that when people talk about, you know, the Enlightenment, they oftentimes on both sides of the conversation, they talk about it as if the Enlightenment was just all about like, you know, celebrating how like reason is like the be all and end all of everything and can be used to figure everything out. And like last year at Rutgers, I taught a class at Hume, Kant in the 18th century, and like the last day of class, I told people if they got nothing else out of this, they should be able to know that that's not right? Like, because at this point they'll have read like hundreds of pages of these major Enlightenment philosophers, Hume and Kant, talking about the limits of reason. You know that you know, Kant's book is not an uncritical celebration of pure reason, right? That's so it's which is a, you know, which is an important point, not so much like in itself, because like anything is particularly politically at stake there, but just because it does go towards how, I don't even remember who I'm stealing this line from, but it's a good line, you know, that to be a conservative is to revere tradition but not know very much about it. You know, that like it has to be this like really hazy kind of like,
you gotta romanticize it.
Yeah, it's this very romanticized kind of like blurry watercolor of the past, you know, and the more sort of nuanced, like, and the more like actual specifics about what really happened, I think then like that's ultimately, you know, when combined with any recognizable human values, any like the more you know about what actually happened in the past, the more likely you are to come to left-wing conclusions about it. And again, going back to what we were talking about before, there's also the other side of like having like a real full appreciation of what's really happened is to be able to construct this more appealing, you know, cultural narratives. But I also like what you said about how oftentimes, like when you get into this sort of Enlightenment humping conservative, you know, thinkers, what they're really saying is, well, like Steven Pinker, right? Like what he's really saying at the bottom of it all is, hey, you got it so much better than like, you know, these slaves and serfs who've lived throughout history. What are you complaining about, right? It's like almost the equivalent of if like somebody said something casually anti-Semitic at a party and you complained about it and they were like, hey, you know, like, you know, do I need to tell you about like all the centuries of pogroms and, you know, this and that, you know, why are you complaining about this? Why are you making such a big deal about it? Right. It's like, no, but it's still screwed up what you said, right?
Yeah, right.
We're freer and more prosperous than serfs and slaves were, but that doesn't mean that like we can't or shouldn't do better. And this is actually the place where I think that it's really important to craft a better left-wing narrative because, you know, I think that like whether we're talking about like Marxism, which certainly emerges out of the Enlightenment tradition, or even if we're just sort of talking about making a basic like populist elevator pitch for social democracy in America in 2019, I think that like a much bigger part of it has got to be talking about freedom, that like what you've like the sort of official endorsed, American capitalist version of freedom is this very like legalistic notion of what freedom is. Like, hey, you signed a contract. Whereas what the left's vision of freedom needs to be is about like really putting some economic flesh on those bones, that like the kind of freedom that we care about is giving people the freedom in practice to really live their lives as they see fit. So, for example, that on the one hand, you don't have people like being you don't have like economic pressures that make it hard to like, keep a relationship going, or that make people reluctant to have kids because they won't be able to take care of them. But on the other hand, you don't have people be like trapped in, bad relationships because they can't afford to leave, right? So if you want to have a traditional family, great, go for it, do that. If you want to live in a, trisexual Wiccan compound, do that, right? It's up to you. And actually, I will say, and if you've heard me on Michael Brooks, you probably know that I usually don't have a lot of good things to say about this guy. But to give credit where credit's due, when Andrew Yang goes around promoting his UBI plan, he's actually pretty good on this, because like oftentimes I hear him use this argument, which is a good argument, that like, hey, if you like just giving people that extra $1,000 a month, that's going to be really good for their personal autonomy, right? If somebody's like, that like if somebody's in a really bad work situation, like the waitress being harassed by her boss, whatever, like having that little economic cushion to make it a little bit easier to like be without a job for a little while you find an alternative situation is actually going to help a lot. So if by freedom we mean the ability in practice to like determine the course of your own life in the ways that are most important to you, then that should absolutely be a selling point for everything from sort of modest social democratic advances up through like really democratizing the economy.
Well, it's so funny because ironically, as I'm listening to you talk, ironically, what you're describing in terms of leftist policies or paralleling Andrew Yang's sort of like UBI proposal, I mean, both of those things are geared toward presenting equality of opportunity, which is so ironic because you have guys like Jordan Peterson who are claiming that, all the left wants is equality of outcome, and that's like this evil thing. But like, honestly, what you're describing is like, it's just the fact that in terms of economic status for most people right now, there isn't equality of opportunity. Like someone like a Jordan Peterson or like a Ben Shapiro would say that if you're in the United States right now, or somewhere in the West or whatever, however they'd frame it, that you already have equality of opportunity. Like you're born into this country, and if you make the right decisions and you work the right jobs and you have discipline, you can make it. But what you're describing is just the opposite, but in the same terms. Like you are saying, like, no, we should have equality of opportunity. We just don't have it. Like we need more of these social programs and more of these all-encompassing new political policies in place in order to grant that for the most people, which it's becoming less and less common. And,
no, absolutely. Like, I mean, the really simple point that Peterson misses when he says this, that like he's even suggested in some places that, quality of opportunity, that's a fine thing, but, quality of outcome, that should be like crossing the line. That like it's suggested that like even in the same way that like white supremacy is like right-wing politics gone too far, equality of outcome is left-wing politics gone too far. And the thing that always struck me as just obviously wrong with this argument, that this idea that we can say we can like really cleanly divide, equality of opportunity is a good thing, but equality of outcome, trying to enforce that is bad. These are just really separable things. Is that one generation's outcomes are the next generation's opportunities. That, like assuming that people are born, assuming that people have, I mean, you could avoid this. Like if we just had some sort of dystopia where like everybody's kids were taken away at birth and like raised in like state orphanages or something, right?
Right,
But
right.
far as I know, nobody advocates that, right? So
Right.
like, your opportunities in life are going to be somewhat shaped by what your parents, have achieved, and then what they can like provide for you. Which means that if you're going to have like, for those things that, there are going to be some positions that not everybody can or should do, right? That like, it's not reasonable to want like, I want everybody to go to college, but I mean, I don't think that it's plausible or desirable that like everybody would go to medical school, for example, right? Not everybody,
Right.
not everybody can or should be a doctor, but we want equality of opportunity for that, right? We don't want it to be the case that like there are some categories of the population where due to some arbitrary, fact about you just couldn't become a doctor.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so, well, okay, if we take that seriously and we take it and like that's pretty straightforward when it comes to something like race, that like that your skin color shouldn't make a difference there, but then like why should your economic background be something that dictates that? And there are a lot of things that you could do. Well, certainly with a very different kind of economy, but like even within the constraints of capitalism, there are a lot of things that you could do to have like a much more level playing field there. Like in terms of education, in terms of putting people in situations where they're not like they don't feel like they need to get an after school job to like
Yep.
help their parents pay the bills.
Even just like legacy programs in colleges where, kids of parents who went to some college just get to go by right of their parent going.
Oh,
Like
I
not,
know it's
it's
insane.
ridiculous. Yeah.
It's the exact like it's the exact opposite of what you could possibly justify, right? Like you
Yeah.
could like really we should have like you should be given credit on college admissions for the fact that your parents didn't go to college.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny listening to you get into all that, especially on the bit about, the fact that as children, we inherit the opportunity of our parents' outcomes. And for me personally, I mean, I grew up pretty comfortably in like middle class parents, like successful small business owners. And ironically, I mean, growing up in that circumstance is what led me to leftism by like taking this
Right.
determinist framework of kind of understanding that like by no free will of my own or choices of my own was I born into this really just and I don't just when I say well off, I mean we aren't rich growing up, but like they're just
Yeah.
great parents, like they were there, they worked hard. It was just very like all like the kind of stereotypical steps were in front placed in front of me, so like even
Yeah.
through whatever struggles that I've had, which obviously everybody, doesn't matter how privileged or whatever horrible circumstances you're in, everybody has struggles. It's relative to a certain degree, but I mean it's not relative in terms of me having those opportunities. I mean like the opportunity is a tangible thing that I can point to, that lots of friends of mine growing up who grew up struggling with issues that were never an issue to me, whether it was addiction or just like depression or lack of economic upward mobility and stability. Like these are things that even if I did struggle with them, like it couldn't be
Uh,
placed on the same scale because like I had something to fall back on. I had, if I really needed a job, I could be like going to my parents and being like, "Hey, do you know somebody who's looking to
sure. Yeah.
hire?" Like all like, simple stuff like that. And it's just so important, I think, to have the perspective to look at it in that way, because I think on the right, I mean, it's all about individualism, and I think there's a beauty in that. Like there's
Uh,
there's definitely like this ideal in place. When you look at like at certain athletes, especially, you see this more so in sports than anywhere else, just because sports are like it's that area where you're gifted with certain natural athletic abilities in a lot of cases that just other people aren't. So I mean, if you're
sure.
if
Yeah.
you're born in like a impoverished area, but you have like gifted genetics in that way, I mean, you can rise out of your socioeconomic circumstances. And I do think that's really important to have those people who are like even like a Jordan Peterson, just from his like pure life coach type shit. Like I think that's fine. Like I think like there's certain people that need to hear that whole like pull yourself up, clean your room, all that is what it is. Like certain people need to hear that, but obviously when you tie in like the politics and all that, it just gets squirrely really quick. But I mean, just in terms of flat out like bringing people out of their circumstances, I'm sure you have as well. Like I've talked to plenty of friends of mine over the years from like really poor backgrounds, and they, just like we're talking about before, like they need a narrative, like they need some kind of hope to pull them out. Like they need a Nike slogan being like, just do it. And to someone like you or I, or we'd like scoff at that and be like, oh, that's just, capitalism churning its wheels. Like they look at it as this symbol of hope to bring them out of whatever their circumstances. So I mean, like, I'd like you to respond in some way. We can kind of wrap up here. I know we've been going a little over how much we plan to talk, but like this is the kind of crux of the conservative argument when it comes to neoliberalism, just like free market capitalism in general, is just that, post-Enlightenment, or however we want to kind of loosely frame this new era that we're living in, is emphasized on individuality and freedom and, like getting the tyranny of government out of the picture, right? And that freedom of, like, there's that branch of, like those branches of freedom, whether it's freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc. Like these are the kind of cornerstone of, or seen as the cornerstone of what brought, the world in large part out of that era into this new era, right? It's just like we kind of created a new system. It created opportunity for people, and now like we have, however many 100 years of capitalism, and the world is in some ways flourishing like it didn't flourish in those centuries prior, in terms of whether it's health or, the riches or however you want to measure it. Like there's all these, like all the Steven Pinker arguments, basically. Like that's all, you can point to that stuff, stripping it from context and say, hey, look, there's great stuff everywhere. Why are we complaining? So when you look at that as like the crux, like that individual freedom, which is important, like how do you respond to that from the left in terms of like arguing with a better narrative? Because from the right, I mean, I think if I look at some like people like my parents, I think the reason that, like we were talking about before, the reason that maybe they look at history through rose-colored glasses, and a lot of conservatives tend to downplay like the United States history of slavery or racism or imperialism, or even like currently like the amount of gun deaths that are going on. Like all these things are downplayed in a lot of contexts because of freedom, right? It's like, well, we have freedom, like we don't want the government taking our guns, or we because of freedom, like we were able to get past slavery and all these things. So in large part, I feel like they look at it like that because they view freedom as so fragile, right? I mean, it's like it's kind of an unstable new experience. Like you mentioned before, it's kind of like seen as the American experiment, and any like entrenchment of ideology like a Marxism kind of, it threatens that experiment. So like they view that all is very fragile. They got to double down, like ignore the criticism, ignore all these flaws. We have to just look ahead, paint a narrative, and that's going to be it. So, I mean, how do you approach all that? I know that was a lot, sorry, but how do you approach all that with a better narrative? I guess I'll frame it that way.
Yeah, good. All right. So the snarky thing I can't help saying about because of freedom, we could overcome slavery, is that that what overcome, like slavery was a private institution, that people privately bought and sold slaves, and it was overcome through the largest and unfortunately bloodiest dose of state coercion in American history. Mm-hmm. But let's not focus on that, right? Because I don't think our sales pitch should be let's recreate massive bloodletting. So I think that there are a few things to be said about all that, and of course, going back to the start of what you're saying, I do think that like most of the Jordan Peterson, like 9 of his 12 rules are good, right? And like the 3 I object to are the one about child rearing, which is kind of weird and authoritarian. That's about like not letting your kids do anything that would make you dislike them. Mm-hmm. The one about petting a cat when you see it in the street, that's a good way of bringing diseases back home to your pets. and the one about not like objecting to things in the wider world until you've set your house in perfect order. That's just like Peterson disguised in reactionary politics as self-help.
Mm-hmm.
But the other 9 are pretty solid. Like,
yeah, they're kind of universal in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, look, and I have met, plenty of young guys, many often at DSA meetings, who could absolutely stand to hear that advice about standing up straight and cleaning your room and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's perfectly good stuff. And honestly, I wish we had some, like, this is something I've talked to Michael Brooks about a lot. It's like, I wish we didn't just cede that territory. Like, I wish there were like, self-help gurus like that who are, on the left, like, clean your room and organize a union.
We'd have less betas.
That's right. But I think that as far as the rest of what you were asking about, it goes back to what we were just talking about freedom, right? So, of course, when it is good, and I can see that it's a part of the appeal of conservative ideas for some people, that it's, the left can sometimes sound like a council of defeat, that, that we have, that you just, that there's too much that's rigged against you. You're not going to rise through the class structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, to the extent that the right could offer something more optimistic, that can be, that can be tremendously appealing to some people who are living in miserable circumstances. And I totally get that, right? So, but I think that the sort of better, the better way to pitch, leftism is that, there's that I think that we can embrace the nuance and have it both ways, right? That we can both say that it's not your fault, right? That, like, that's the sort of liberating part of what we're saying, that it's not like if you're a better person, then you would have overcome poverty by now.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not like we're against making it, right? We're for making it. We want to make it easier to make it, like, and that gets back to all these points about how, like, social democracy can make it easier for people to, to be upwardly mobile. And we don't want people to be like, we're not such fans of upwardly mobility that we want some people to get up to 500 times the incomes of other people. But we want, reasonable upward mobility. And that's, and that's totally consistent even with having a much deeper structural critique of capitalism, that, like, we would prefer, like, an economy where workers were running their own, workplaces, but like that's still, in fact, one of the advantages of that kind of economy is that if you had people who, like, for example, when new automation happened, instead of, so like you only needed 3/4 as many people instead of 3 out of every 4 workers working as hard as ever and one of them losing their jobs, you might very well just vote to spread around the work that still ought to be done more thinly. So, like, 4 out of 4 people could just work 6 hours instead of 8 hours. And then that gives you 2 hours to pursue whatever projects you want to do. And you're going to have a lot more people doing things like going back to school and, learning new talents, and et cetera, that could ultimately help them maybe do other things with their lives under those circumstances. And again, even in a more immediate way, right? Like, that you can have anything that, like, makes people a little bit less tethered to their bosses, that, like, oh, if I piss them off too bad, like, I'll get fired and I'll lose my health insurance. Is going to make people freer, right? So what we want is, like, of course, a free market system is better than feudalism or slavery. Nobody denies that. Like, absolutely, but the problem, so that's the good thing about it, that it's the extent to which it's different. But the bad thing about it is the extent to which it's similar, right? That even though we have, we don't have an economy where rich people can literally buy and sell poor people, we still have an economy that's entirely too hierarchical. We can go further in the direction of not being like slavery and feudalism, and in terms of freedom, of course, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these are all tremendously important things. But even on a basic social democratic level, the like economic Bill of Rights that FDR talked about, and that like Bernie Sanders has kind of dusted off this election cycle when he's talked a lot about completing the New Deal, which is a nice open-ended slogan that I like a lot, is like these aren't even just unrelated things like, okay, we have political rights like free speech and, you know, freedom of religion, but we also have economic rights. It's that the economic rights really put flesh on the bones of the political rights, that like we have it's, you know, that it's one thing to say that that people have, that everybody has a right to, you know, to live their life how they choose, and it's a very different thing to say that people actually have the ability to live their lives how they choose.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty empty if you just have a legalistic right to it, but you're not able to actually act on it. And then like finally, like, you know, like I think that like probably as leftists we should do a better job of hearing what people are saying when they talk about what you know, the American experiment and all that stuff, not because we have to agree with their narrative about it, but because we have to think harder about how we're going to promote ours.
Yeah.
So there's this quote that I thought actually might be a really nice cap on the conversation from Michael Harrington, who was a late 20th century socialist thinker. And he wrote, "It was as a socialist and because I was a socialist that I fell in love with America. I'm not, in saying that, I'm not indulging in romantic nostalgia about youthful days on the road, but rather underlining a crucial political truth. If the left wants to change this country because it hates it, then people will never listen to the left and people will be right. To be a socialist is to sense the seed beneath the snow, to see beneath the veneer of corruption and meanness and the commercialization of human relationships, men and women capable of controlling their own destinies." And there's so much that I like in those two paragraphs. But I mean, I think that's got to be I think that's what Cornel West was showing really well in the Joe Rogan interview, and that's got to be what we're sort of always aiming at. That, like, you know, finding a way to promote, you know, left ideas and policies that doesn't come off as just sort of like hating on, you know, the culture, the society that we've already got, but that's about, you know, expanding meaningful freedom, controlling their destinies, and about like seeing the sort of potential of what we've got and how it could be better.
I love that, man. And I think it's so important too, and just it echoes this idea of not just deconstructing an existing ideology, but then actually putting forth a new ideology to reconstruct what's there. And I think when people on the right or center right, you know, look at the quote unquote left, which is just this amorphous, you know, they might be comparing, you know, people who are just liberals with leftists, that they kind of look at the whole thing as the same bubble, and they look at it as this big deconstructionist project, which it's largely highlighted in people in like social justice circles or people that are kind of constantly tearing down pre-existing institutions in a way, which they should be. I mean, there's a lot of criticism
Sure.
that institutions warrant, and like obviously they're doing work on the ground that should be there, but I think they often get the spotlight, and then that becomes the driving narrative where it's like, oh, people on the left, they just want to tear everything down and they hate America. But it's ironic how you move a little further left to the variants of leftism, and you get this reconstruction. Like you're saying, there's actually like a passion underneath there, not just for people, but for actually creating or rebuilding a system in a way that actually works for the most amount of people. And I think that's, again, it speaks to this whole reiteration of why like a Cornel West or Bernie Sanders is able to tap in to those, you know, center right or even alt right portions of like a Joe Rogan's audience, because they're already feeling a lot of these the economic pressures, and they're in these, you know, socially isolated circumstances in a lot of cases where, you know, they fell into one narrative, and all they're being fed through that narrative is like, this is good, that is bad, you know, the right is good, the left is bad. And when you actually give them something like give them an argument, you know, you give them some actual substantive policy that's actually offering them some hope in some way, it actually opens them up in ways that on the surface seem impossible, but all you gotta do is do a little digging and you get there. And I think it's so important to have that mindset in terms of rebuilding any kind of society or institution, just having a lens to look through in a hopeful way and not just like, oh, this thing is bad, let's just tear it all down, because that only gets you halfway there. You know what I mean? So I think it's super important to be able to demonstrate an ideology that actually gives people something. And in terms of where we're at today economically, I mean, again, it only makes sense that we're seeing this rise of leftism right now, where people are actually gravitating toward these ideas. And it's not all, you know, this super nerded out theory version of it that like maybe like I was gonna say me, but I'm not even on the same spectrum as someone like you in terms of just like actually being passionate about like the source literature and the philosophy and getting deep into, you know, centuries of theory on these matters. Like that's like definitely a niche part of the movement, which is, you know, building up the philosophy from the ground up. But most people are just attracted because they're normal, average, working class people that, like you said, they want the freedoms to do what they can do, but they're tethered to these jobs with insurances and bosses that maybe they hate, or at least, you know, wish they could, you know, kick to the curb and actually do something that they love, but they're trapped in all these various, you know, poor socioeconomic circumstances, and they don't have the freedoms that they've essentially been promised their whole life. And I think, you know, it's great to have like more people like you who are actually laying out the arguments in a way that makes this whole thing feel way less taboo and way less just scary for the people, I guess, that haven't ever sat down and heard it from someone, you know?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's great stuff, man. And again, I appreciate you for sticking on. I know we went a little over time. But
yeah, no problem.
I can't recommend your content enough. The new book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is the best place on Amazon to find that, or...
Yeah, I mean, you could get that on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or, you know, I mean, if you want to, I mean, I'm sure that like if there's some, you know, local bookstore you want to support or whatever, they won't have it, but you know, but I'm sure they'd at least order it for you.
Yeah, there you go. And I should say too that, I mean, there's so many topics that we could have covered on here. I mean, there's an endless amount of, you know, arguments and ranges that we could have gone down, but I know that you're very open to debate, you know, on these topics, and you've had showings with street people like the streamer Destiny and the I don't even know how to describe him, but the reactionary talking head that is known as Jesse Lee Peterson. And I really don't even know what to call him. I mean, is he far right? Is he like I don't know, but anyway, so I know you're very open to the discourse, quote unquote, and again, I appreciate that, and I encourage anyone listening to check out your stuff on YouTube and all that. So thanks again for coming on, man.
Much appreciated. Thank you.